The traditional square of opposition is an elegant way to relate all forms of a categorical proposition with a given subject and a given predicate. That is, as an A type of proposition, I type of proposition, E type of proposition, or O type of proposition. We can take a given categorical proposition and then compare it with three different propositions that only differ with that given original proposition by the quantity and or quality. We can think about the logical relationships between these propositions. With the traditional square of opposition, we have contradictory propositions, contrary propositions, subcontrary propositions, and alternate propositions. Now, I am the amateur logician from amateurlogician.com, and at my website you will find an extensive tutorial on traditional verbal style logic, including an entry on the traditional square of opposition. Learning the square of opposition will help you in your critical thinking skills, your critical reasoning abilities. Consider, for example, the proposition all men are mortal. Now, with these four different propositions, we have the same exact subject and predicate. The subject is men, the predicate is mortal or mortality. Now, with all men are mortal, we have a universal affirmative proposition, also known as an A type of proposition. We have some men are mortal. That's a particular affirmative proposition. Note that when we say some, we mean at least one. So we have at least one man who is mortal. That's an I type of proposition. No men are mortal is a universal negative proposition, an E type of proposition. And some men are not mortal is a negative particular proposition. Once again, note that some means at least one. So there's at least one man who is not mortal. That's an O type of proposition. Now, the strongest type of opposition on the square of opposition deals with contradictories. We're thinking about A versus O or E versus I. It's the strongest type of opposition because there's a difference in the quality and the quantity. We're moving from the A proposition, which is a universal affirmative, to an O type of proposition, which is a negative particular. So there's a difference both in the quantity and the quality. Consider all men are mortal. Well, if that's true, then it must be false that some men are not mortal. If there's one man who is not mortal, then it cannot be the case that all men are mortal. That's just common sense. Conversely, if all men are mortal is false, then some men are not mortal must be true. In other words, one being false guarantees the other one being true, and one being true guarantees the other one being false. So in general, with contradictory propositions, namely when we're thinking about A versus O or E versus I, one must be true and the other must be false. We can then think about contrary propositions. It's an opposition of quality with universal propositions. So we're thinking about A versus E. If we consider all men are mortal, once again, and we compare that to no men are mortal, there's no way both can be true. But logically speaking, both may be false. However, if all men are mortal is false, let's just say that is false, then no men are mortal is indeterminate. Because one being true guarantees the other one being false, but only knowing that one is false doesn't tell us the truth value of the other proposition, since both can be false. So with contrary propositions, both cannot be true, but both may be false. And here again, we're thinking about A versus E. Next, we have subcontrary propositions. And here we're thinking about, that coloring is really, really bad. But we're thinking about I versus O in this case. So it's an opposition of quality with particular propositions. So take the propositions, some men are mortal, some men are not mortal. If, for example, some men are not mortal is false, then some men are mortal must be true. Conversely, if some men are mortal is true, some men are not mortal is indeterminate. In other words, one being false guarantees the other one being true, but only knowing that one is true doesn't tell us the truth value of the other proposition, since both can be true. So with subcontraries, again, we're thinking about I versus O. Both cannot be false, but both may be true. And then we have alternate propositions. And here we're thinking about A versus I or E versus O. And here on the traditional square of opposition, the truth of the universal implies the truth of its corresponding particular, but the falsity of the particular implies the falsity of the corresponding universal. So if we say all men are mortal is true, so if this is true, all men are mortal, that will imply that there's at least one man who is mortal. That must be true. If it is true that no men are mortal, then it must be true that some men are not mortal. However, if some men are mortal is false, it must be false that all men are mortal. So the falsity of the particular implies the falsity of the corresponding universal. We might say that truth moves downward from A to I, or from E to O, and then falsity moves upward from I to A, or from O to E. However, truth doesn't move upward, and falsity doesn't move downward. So if all men are mortal is true, then some men are mortal must be true. Conversely, if all men are mortal is false, then some men are mortal is indeterminate. So with alternate propositions, A versus I, E versus O, if the universal is true, then the particular is true. If the particular is false, then the universal is false. For example, let's consider something like this. We have everything is matter. We have nothing is matter. We have something is matter. We have something is not matter. So clearly, for example, if it is true that everything is matter, then it must be false that something is not matter. That's a contradictory relationship. And that seems pretty obvious. But it is possible, for example, that everything is matter is false, and nothing is matter is false, where something is matter is true, and something is not matter is true. That's one logical possibility. Or consider this exercise. Let's say we know that it's given that whatever this proposition has to be, some S is not P, that's false. What can we say about the other propositions? Well, by contradictory relationship, the strongest type of opposition, we know that all S is P must be true. But if that's the case, SIP is true. And then by contradictory relationship, we know that SEP must be false. But we also know that by the alternate relation. So if O is false, E is false. Or consider SEP is false. Well, again, we can think about contradictory relationships. So if that's false, SIP is true. Some S is P. But that's really all we can say. This is indeterminate. This is indeterminate. SAP might be false, or it may be true. That's consistent with just knowing that SEP is false. Moreover, just because SEP is false, SOP is left open. Just because SIP is true, SOP is left open. All we know for a fact, so to speak, given that we know that SEP is false as a fact, we know that SIP must be true, and SAP and SOP, we just don't know. Finally, consider SEP as true. Well, again, let's just think about the strongest type of opposition, SEP versus SIP. So if E is true, well, I is false. By subcontrary relationship, if I is false, O is true. But we also know by alternate relation that if E is true, O is true. Now, SAP and SEP cannot be both true simultaneously, so by this contrary relationship, if SEP is true, SAP is false, but that also makes sense that if SOP is true down here, then by contradictory relationship, SAP must be false. So given that O is true, or we derived O is true, A is false. Now things get a little bit hairy here, however, because the modern square of opposition, from the Boolean viewpoint, things radically change here, because modern logic defines all and some differently than Aristotelian scholastic logic. And the result is that all forms of opposition minus contradictory relation, or contradictory opposition, namely between A versus O or E versus I, become logically undetermined. And that's because universal propositions are treated as hypothetical or conditional. And particular propositions are taken to claim that the subject really or actually exists. So if I say all men are mortal, in predicate logic, we're just saying that if men in fact exist, then all these men are mortal. Okay, that's all. It doesn't affirm the existence of men. So things become hairy with the modern square of opposition. Because we can't say anything really about alternates or contraries or subcontraries. The only type of relation that really holds is between contradictories, because everything else becomes logically undetermined. But that is another subject for another time. But in any case, I hope this video has been helpful. And if you enjoy this type of work, please check out my website, amateurlogician.com. Please consider buying me a cup of coffee. I would really appreciate that. There's a link below. And giving this video a like. Until next time, good luck to you and be well.